It was the first clear morning after weeks of rain, September 1945. The war was over, but the air still hung thick with the smell of burned fuel and surrender. At a small military airfield outside Tokyo, a group of Japanese engineers gathered around an enormous silver shape that had just been delivered by U.S. forces under tight guard, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Its skin caught the sunlight like polished steel, and for a long moment no one moved. The men simply stood in silence, staring at the aircraft that had once thundered over their skies, cutting through formation after formation of Japanese fighters. Now it lay still before them, its wings broad as a barn door, its fuselage squat and muscular, built not for beauty but for endurance. A few of the engineers, still in their faded uniforms, carried notebooks worn from years of improvising wartime designs. They approached the machine cautiously, almost reverently, as though touching it might summon the ghosts of the pilots it once carried. When permission came from the American officer in charge, delivered with a nod and a quiet, "Go ahead, gentlemen," the men began to work. Wrenches clicked. Panels came loose. The Thunderbolt's armor opened like the shell of some mechanical beast, revealing the heart of its power. What they saw inside stunned them. The engine alone looked impossible. 18 cylinders arranged in perfect symmetry, each one hand fitted with precision so tight it felt like jewelry. The nameplate, Pratt & Whitney R, 2800 Double Wasp, glinted faintly in the light. To the Japanese engineers, it might as well have read another world. They measured its pistons, traced the cooling ducts, examined the fuel injection lines, and realized that the Americans had built not merely an engine, but a living system. It could be damaged, overheated, even shot through, and still bring a pilot home. One man muttered that the bolts holding the cowling were stronger than the steel used in an entire Zero's frame. Another, running his fingers along the oil lines, marveled at the redundancies. "It flies, even if half of it dies," he said quietly. Around him, the others took notes, drew diagrams, whispered comparisons. They had spent years designing planes that could turn tighter, climb faster, save metal, save fuel. But this was something else entirely. The Americans had built a machine that didn't just fight, it endured. As the day went on, the hangar filled with the smell of hot metal and grease. The men began to understand the logic behind every component. Each piece was designed not for elegance but for repeatability, for mass production. It was a kind of industrial poetry. Interchangeable parts, standardized bolts, simplified fittings. The Thunderbolt was not the work of a single genius engineer. It was the result of an entire nation working in unison. Late in the afternoon, as the sun sank and long shadows crept across the floor, one of the older engineers leaned against a wing spar and said softly, "They didn't win with pilots. They won with factories." His word hung in the air, neither bitter nor admiring, just true. The others nodded silently, their hands blackened with oil, their notebooks heavy with revelations. By evening, the Thunderbolt stood half disassembled, its skin peeled back to reveal the bones of a civilization that had mastered machinery at a scale Japan had never imagined. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the twilight, and somewhere in the distance a train whistle blew, a small, human sound amid the hum of industry awakening again. One engineer paused before leaving, glancing once more at the stripped aircraft. In his journal that night, he wrote a single line, "We built ours to dance. They built theirs to survive." It was not a confession of defeat. It was a beginning of understanding. The year after Japan's surrender felt like the long pause between breaths. The empire was gone, its cities flattened, its factories silent. Yet in small workshops and half-ruined university labs, the men who had once taken apart the Thunderbolt began meeting again, quietly, almost furtively. They were no longer weapons engineers. They were simply craftsmen who had seen something they couldn't forget. The memory of that American engine, The clean logic of its design, the unapologetic strength of its parts, stayed with them. In a corner of the University of Tokyo's engineering faculty, a handful of former aircraft designers gathered around salvaged drafting tables. They redrew sections of the Thunderbolt's cooling system from memory, discussing airflow, pressure ratios, and manufacturing tolerances far beyond anything Japan's wartime factories had achieved. Others traveled to Osaka and Nagoya, where Allied officials had begun allowing limited technical reconstruction for civilian purposes. What began as curiosity slowly turned into purpose. They realized that what had made the Thunderbolt extraordinary wasn't just its power. It was the system that built it. America's strength lay in its ability to coordinate. Machine tools in Chicago, ball bearings in Pennsylvania, fuel systems in Texas, all designed to fit together perfectly. Japan had fought a war of brilliance on an island of scarcity. Now, it needed to build a nation of coordination. By 1947, under the watchful eyes of American occupation authorities, Japan's engineers began repurposing their knowledge. They sketched engines for fishing boats, tractors, and motorcycles. What they couldn't yet build, they studied. The old wartime notes on the Thunderbolt circulated like sacred texts among young apprentices who had never seen an airplane up close. It was as if the Americans had shown us the blueprint of the future, one recalled decades later. All we had to do was follow the lines. Factories that once stamped out fuselages now produce sewing machines and small motors. The same precision demanded by flight was redirected toward endurance and efficiency. The principle was simple. If something as complex as a Thunderbolt could be made reliable, then anything could. And from that mindset grew a new generation of engineers. Patient, exacting, obsessed with quality rather than speed. Some of those men later joined the young automotive firms sprouting in the rubble: Toyota, Honda, Nissan. They spoke of airflow the way pilots once spoke of altitude, of torque as if it were lift. Their first engine sputtered and smoked, but each one ran a little longer, a little smoother. When the first Japanese motorcycles rolled down the streets of Tokyo in the early 1950s, their designers knew exactly what sound they were chasing. That deep, confident hum they once heard when the Thunderbolt came alive. Ironically, a few American officers who had once guarded those hangars returned to Japan as corporate advisors and engineers. They found their former adversaries now producing machines so refined that even U.S. companies began to take notice. One veteran reportedly walked through a Nagoya factory in 1959 and whispered, half in disbelief, "They built the future out of what we left behind." By the 1960s, the echo of the Thunderbolt's engine could be heard not in the roar of warplanes, but in the purr of exports crossing Pacific, radios, cars, cameras. The philosophy born from dismantling that single aircraft had rippled through an entire nation. The same men who once studied a weapon now built machines that connected, entertained, and transported millions. In a sense, Japan never stopped taking the Thunderbolt apart. Each new invention was another lesson learned, another bolt turned toward perfection. Out of the wreckage of defeat had come an almost spiritual reverence for craftsmanship. The war had taught them destruction. The Thunderbolt had taught them discipline. When one of the surviving engineers was interviewed late in life, he smiled at the memory. "We thought we were studying an airplane," he said, "but what we were really studying was a civilization." And so, from the ashes of surrender, the engines of a new era began to turn, not loud, not boastful, but steady, confident, unstoppable. The same way that Silver Machine had once filled the sky over Japan, its echo now filled the world.